Good morning, or I should say good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this training session brought to you by the Society of American Archivists, Archivists of Religious Collections Section. My name is Vinny Barraza, and we acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional lands of many indigenous nations. We know that indigenous peoples have suffered from historical and ongoing injustices, and understand as an archival organization that we must work towards sharing historical truths and renew respectful relationships with indigenous communities. We respect the long-standing relationships that indigenous nations have to this land as the original caretakers. We are grateful for their stewardship and protection of the water and earth. We pay our respects to elders past and present. Today's topic is archival appraisal for beginners. Before I introduce our presenter, let's review the disclaimer. The content in these presentations is for information only and is not legal advice. Our views do not represent the organizations where we work. We do not make any endorsements or guarantees. We are not liable for any loss or damage caused by your use of the content we provide. It is your responsibility to critically evaluate the content provided in the presentation or any accompanying materials. Also, please remember the points shown on this slide. You will not be able to use your microphone or video during this session. You can click on the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen, and under live transcript, click Enable Auto Transcription to get closed captioning. There will be a question period after the presentation concludes. You should use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. We will not answer any questions you post in the chat or unmute attendees due to time constraints. Please be respectful in your interactions. We expect you to follow the SAA Code of Conduct. The session is being recorded. Please fill out the short survey after the session ends. We encourage you to join the Society of American Archivists if you are not a member, and we thank the congregations of the Sisters of St. Joseph in Canada for hosting this webinar. And now I would like to introduce our presenter. Nicole Menchise received a BA in geography from the University of Memphis, where she concentrated her studies in cartography and history. She completed her MLIS at the Long Island University with the Advanced Certificate in Archives and Records Management. She is currently the Digitization and Archives Coordinator for the Long Island Library Resources Council, where she offers educational workshops, provides advice for the processing, housing, and display of special collections, oversees participation in the New York Heritage Digital Collections website for cultural institutions on Long Island, and executes the annual Long Island Archives Conference. Previously, she managed the collections of the Oyster Bay Historical Society, Raynham Hall Museum, and the Townsend Society of America, Sewanaka Yacht Club, and the North Shore Historical Museum as a trustee. Please welcome Nicole.
Thank you, Vincent. I appreciate that. Nice little introduction. Okay, folks, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get right into it. There we go. There we go. And Vincent, if you don't mind giving me the thumbs up to let me know everything looks good. Fantastic. Okay, folks, good afternoon. I'm going to just kind of close my window here. Welcome to Archival Appraisal for Beginners. I've been honored to be a part of this series, and this is actually one of 3 that I've done for the Archivists of Religious Collections section of SAA. Getting a little bit more involved in each of the processes of archival management. Previously, we did a program, or I did a program on acquisitions and accessioning and arrangement. Today, we're going to talk more about appraisal. According to the DACS, Describing Archives Content Standard, appraisal is the process of determining the archival value of records, and a number of considerations go into the appraisal decisions. And we're going to talk today about all of these different things that you have to think about when you are appraising your not only future and current donations, but also when you go back through and inventory your collections to think about what it is you may deaccession. So why does appraisal matter? You'll see here on the right, I have a picture of someone pruning a tree. I like to think of collections as a living, breathing thing that requires nurturing and requires occasional pruning. Appraisal satisfies this in a couple of different ways. Essentially, you were asking yourself the question, should this object or these records be in our collection? It's the activity of taking the time to understand what values the donation will offer to the organization that you're in. And it can be done during the accessioning process. When I showed you that earlier list, the thing about these archival management processes is that they kind of bleed into each other. So if you're receiving a donation and you've already made an appointment with the donor and you're sitting down, and so you kind of already have a feeling of what it is that they're bringing in, you can kind of already be in the midst of the appraising as you're doing the accessioning. When we think about acquisitions, that's a different matter, because that's something that you have sought out to add to your collection. So you already know what the value of it is. It's already valuable to you. We're going to talk a lot about value, how many different kinds of values there are in a collection, and try and break that down into bite-sized pieces that will hopefully make it a little less intimidating. I will also note that records managers, they do appraising as well, but they're really more in line with retention schedules and creating those retention schedules. For most of us in America, the retention schedules that are in our everyday lives are, say, paying our taxes every year, or hopefully you're paying your taxes every year. We'll hang on to our returns for 7 years, 10 years, maybe 13 years, and then we let those things go. Sometimes we hang on to bills, and eventually we're like, this is from 1987. I think I can toss this out. So that's kind of the layperson's retention schedules. And so records managers, they're doing appraisal, but in a little bit different way than, say, you or I or anyone who's working in a cultural institution is doing it. So this is my attempt at a value cloud. There's a lot of different types of value. Most of the time, though, when we think of value, we think of money. And sometimes that's what your board is thinking about. Sometimes that's what your donors are thinking about. So I devoted an entire slide to market value, because there's some nuances here that I really want to make sure that we cover. So this is what comes to mind when we say the word value, the value of our collection. People just immediately think about what's it worth in dollars. And so it is a value that we are considering, but it should never, ever drive the decision to make that we make for bringing in a donation. Couple of circumstances. Somebody may decide to donate a beautiful piece of art to your collection, knowing that you will eventually sell it to make money to go back into your collection. That doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Also, if there is like a fair market value that you're trying to get for your donor, because they are interested in giving you a really beautiful and expensive piece of whatever, whether it be, places I've worked, I've had signed photographs from President Theodore Roosevelt, so we had to get that evaluated. And when we do things like that, it's critical that you get a third-party appraiser who has little, if nothing, to do with your board or yourself. Okay, so if you are or someone on your board or is employed by your organization has a nephew or an uncle or whomever who is an appraiser, whether it's art or antiques, and they're coming in to do the work, it's really kind of better to just find somebody who is completely independent of your organization. It's not to say that there will be, unscrupulous activity, but you want to be as above board as possible, as people that are charged with the public's trust to take care of these historic items. We are, bound by an ethics that requires us to just try and provide the most transparent and but basically we're trying to be as transparent as possible. And so having a third party appraiser come in and actually value your collection is the way to go. Also very important to mention, and maybe at another time we can talk about deaccessioning. Every state is different with what is expected of museums, historical societies, cultural institutions, and their deaccessioning process. But if you are going to deaccession an item and sell it for market value, or then you are going to need to make sure that money that comes in goes back into the collection, whether through another acquisition or other ways that it's outlined for you. I believe, Society of American Archivists has a page and some booklets about that sort of thing. So just remember that value, when we think about our collections, even though our minds may be drawn, or even board members may be drawn to the idea of money as value, we are looking at it through a different lens. And these are this next slide here. It's not very exciting looking slide, and it looks like a page from a dictionary. But I wanted to have a very simple, concise definition of these different types of value and some real world examples that will help sort of flesh them out for you. So first, we have to look at a donation as having, or whether it has administrative value. Now, typically, administrative value comes from the archival materials or the archival records that your institution is already creating. So things like Board of Trustee minutes or donation paperwork, thank you letters. I have here as an example, blueprints. Perhaps your organization or the building that you are housing your collections in has undergone some kind of renovation, or maybe there was some damage and walls needed to be replaced, or what have you. Any of those kind of records are going to have that administrative value. So the usefulness or significance of records in supporting the operation and management of the organization that created them. So in our case, for folks like us that are working in these institutions, it's things like board minutes and things that show the how the processes within our organization have functioned, the functioning records of our organization. And then we go to artifactual value. So an item may have artifactual value because it is a particularly good example of the type of item or the class to which it belongs. So a good example of this would be a really well-maintained 19th century sampler. And for those of you that might not know what a sampler is, it's the cross-stitching of the alphabet, sometimes numbers, and it was often the way young women basically learned and were taught letters and numbers in the 1800s and actually 18th century as well. But essentially, if you have something like that and it's a really well maintained piece, it's an excellent example of what a sampler is that has artifactual value. A working Edison wax cylinder phonograph. that has artifactual value because perhaps it's an excellent condition, it's working. Then we move on to enduring value. That is the usefulness or significance of records based on the information they contain that justifies their permanent or ongoing preservation. So, for example, presidential correspondence. But for most of us, we would have something like indentures or deeds, commonly known, and wills. So the information that they contain is so specific that it justifies their ongoing preservation. So that's enduring. That makes sense. Then we have evidential value, which is the usefulness of records that provides information about the origins, functions, and activities of their creators. So thinking about the section of people that I'm talking to, the religious collection section, I'm thinking about the Weeks Family Bible, or a family Bible that I'm sure most of you have got several of in your collections. So it's important so that I understand a little bit more about the Weeks family. Perhaps there is, for those of you that are not in religious collections and are just like working at a historical society or a house museum or what have you, maybe there's a business that closed down. Maybe it was open from 1923 to 1965, and you have copies of the ledgers from that that business. So that's evidence of the functions of that business. And then more on personal level, we find diaries or scrapbooks, which tells us about the lives of the people that created them. So that is what is meant by evidential value. And I'll go ahead and just say that there's nothing that means that you have to only have one value. Things can have legal value and artifactual value. Things can have historical value, which we're getting into next, which actually covers a pretty wide swath of items. I'm sure if we wanted to, we could probably find some historical value in just about everything. But you don't necessarily have just one or another. Many items in our collection have one or more of these values. So moving back through our list, we have historical value, which is the usefulness or significance of records for understanding the recorded human past. So that's a lot. That can be a lot of different things. When I was working this list up, I was thinking about examples that kind of help solidify these different values in my mind. And I was thinking about artwork that depicts historical battles or a scene. So we've all seen the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. I'm pretty sure George Washington wasn't wearing his uniform and standing there very regally at the bow with one knee bent, looking out over the Delaware. There's been probably books written about how that crossing actually went down historically, and how the painting really glamorizes, I suppose, that event. But it does let us kind of get an idea. Some other paintings, though, may really, and photographs, really kind of give us a sense of what really happened at the time. So we have artwork, significance of things like pottery, photographs, even telegrams that let us understand how things came about in our recorded human history, sound recordings, even things like oral histories. All of these have historical value. And then we move into things like intrinsic value. This is one I always seem to have a problem with remembering. Intrinsic value may include an item's form, layout, materials, or process. It also may be based on an item's direct relationship to a significant person, activity, event, organization, or place. So that's a lot. So some examples. I'm thinking of a Victorian era crazy quilt that came into the collection at the Oyster Bay Historical Society. It's a quilt, just like any other quilt, but what's really neat about a crazy quilt is that it's a kind of a patchwork quilt, but not in the way that we think of patchwork in contemporary or historically speaking quilts. It's usually jaggedy edges, just bits of scrap. It can be multiple types of fabric. So you can have velvets, you can have silks. So that's why it got the nickname, I suppose, of a crazy quilt, because it looks a little crazy. But what's fascinating about a crazy quilt is it really tells us about what the quilter had on hand, what fabrics were, and what patterns within fabrics. I never really understood that, how far back the pattern of paisley went, until I started working with a 19th century textile collection. So think about things like that. A yearbook, even Peyton Manning's football jersey. Okay, that not only has intrinsic value, but it also has artifactual value. Photographs documenting 9/11. And another thing that I was thinking about as well was also at the Oyster Bay Historical Society, we had a series of drawings from Oleg Cassini, the fashion designer who did live in Oyster Bay for a little while. And what was donated, this was donated before I was an archivist there, it was sort of like his storyboards of his design. So it would be the drawing of the design, and then there'd be the scraps of fabric and different notes being taken all on this one board. And it was just this really fascinating piece. And you got to understand, or hope to understand, the process of Mr. Cassini and how his art came to be. So that is a part of what intrinsic value is. So there's not going to be a test after this, but it's really good to be able to understand all of these different vocabulary words, because as you're reading more and more and learning more about the art and the work of archival management, it's good to kind of understand the difference. Most people on the outside think everything's just got historical value, but and maybe in this sense, I understand why they do. But when you're really kind of trying to justify a donation, it's nice to be able to also categorize them in one of these other values. There's legal value, which is, again, very similar to administrative value. It's the type of records that you're required to keep by law, so that you're not in any, in case something comes up and you need to be able to have records to show, that you were in compliance with the law, or things like emails right now, and saving those emails for a certain amount of time. So all of that is required with legal value, or I should say described with legal value. And then we have research value, which is the usefulness or significance of materials based on their content, independent of any intrinsic or evidential value. And the perfect example of that are newspaper clippings. Now, we know that newspapers, the paper itself, is every day that it's out there and getting older, it's getting more and more frail, more and more brittle. And so it's the information, especially, say, with obituaries, it's the information that is critical for your research, or your researchers. So having research value doesn't necessarily mean that you have to keep the item as is. I'm not interested in keeping that little tiny clipping that's falling apart. But what I am going to do is I'm going to either scan it or digitize it. And of course, before we had the capability and technology of being able to digitize things, or at least digitizing them en masse as we do now, we would make a Xerox copy so that something on a little bit more of a stable paper could maintain the important information that was withheld, or not withheld, within that scrap or that newspaper clipping, without having to actually maintain that clipping itself. Okay, in the next slide, is the other slide that we're going to spend a little more time on. So this is kind of where I start. I guess this is where the rubber hits the road. Okay. So things to consider, acquisitions and appraisal. Now, usually with acquisitions, you already know that you want, and you've sought it out, what you want for your collection. But we do have to think about these things when we're either seeking out something new or receiving something in as a donation, especially with donations. So let's talk about these 4 squares. Number 1, your organization's capacity. Do you actually have the space to provide safe storage for the item that someone is trying to donate? I've been in a couple of places with my site visits, and I've walked into rooms where there is a closet or a storage area, and it's full of Victorian furniture. And I would ask the director, whoever is giving me the tour for the site visit, and I'd say, well, what's the significance of this? And they'd say, well, somebody was emptying out their house and they had this old furniture and they brought it to us, and so we took it. And I just thought to myself, why? Why did you take this? This is taking up all of your storage. And unless you have a real reason to keep all of this, I mean, granted, it's beautiful furniture, it was well kept, but you have to think about all these considerations. Like, where are you going to keep it? Is it really ever going to be out of this closet for display? Did you need the entire set of furniture? Were you planning on selling it later and, making some money to buy something that makes more sense to have in your collection? I hesitate to say this, but sometimes I get this look on people's faces when I say something like this, but just because something is old, and even just because something is beautiful, doesn't mean that it's valuable to your collection. And it doesn't mean that you're required to keep it. Or accept it, rather. If you don't have the space to take care of something, then you should really consider whether or not it's valuable enough for you to have in your organization's collection. The second thing I want to bring up here is another important point that sometimes people don't really think about is how much staff do you have? Are you the only person working? Are you the only person that's going to be able to take care of these items? And so if you get a large collection in, who's going to process it? In an ideal world, you would have someone who would call you and say, I want to donate, I'll just use an example. Someone who is a village or town historian passed away, and their children came to me and said, we've got all of his stuff, and he's got so much stuff and so much research. And I really, it's got to go somewhere, and it should come here because this is his town, and this is where he devoted his life. And what we ended up doing was I went to their home, or his home rather, and went through all of the stuff, and was able to pick through and find things that I knew I wanted. Some books we didn't need, but I had to really be judicious in how I selected these items. This is also where, in case you do get blindsided and somebody just shows up with several boxes of stuff, where a temporary custody receipt is your best friend, because that temporary custody receipt will allow you to bring things in. It's a promise that you will take it, but it's not a promise that you will keep it. So you can use that temporary custody receipt and have a little bit of time to go through everything and appraise everything and assign value to things, and then determine whether or not you want to actually accession it into your collection. So going back to the point on this square, think about who's going to do the work and how long is it going to take. And if it's a great collection and you want it, then it's fine. If it takes a lifetime to process it, so be it. If it's if it checks all the boxes on your collections policy, your mission statement, as I would imagine a local historians might, then fine, take it in, process it as you can. Maybe just do a quick survey and get to it in pieces over time. But be mindful of how long it's going to take and who's going to do the work. Another important consideration, your organization's environment. So this is a little tough. It's a little bit heartbreaking to talk to people about this, but sometimes the location in which you are collecting or keeping your collections is just not great. It's not really adequate. It's not up to par with what standards and best practices are. I've worked in house museums where there was, one little air conditioner and nothing keeping the attic cool, and that's where all the stuff was. And then I've worked in places that have had a 3-story HVAC on every floor, climate controlled environment. So I've seen both sides. And what is most important is really being honest about your space. And can you actually provide that stable temperature and relative humidity that might be required by this collection that's coming in? So it's almost like an appraisal of your own space. And another thing to keep in mind, can you keep it safe from theft? Some organizations are, I guess, physically managed by well, I know there are several organizations here on Long Island that are managed by the townships. So it's the town employees that come and they mow the lawn and they take care of the hedges in a historic house. Sometimes, if there's a plumbing issue, something minor, they'll come in and fix that. But that's also a lot of people coming and going out of that historic house. And so I'm not making any accusations or even suggesting that, things could happen. Well, I am suggesting that things could happen. Things could happen. You have to think about the safety of your collection. So can you keep this precious painting safe from potential threat, from potential environmental problems? I mean, are we putting the Mona Lisa under a leaky roof? Obviously, we're not doing that. But you get what I'm trying to say. And what we want to do is try and get our environments really in line as quickly as possible. That's typically the very first thing I do on a site visit. I talk to people about their environment and getting it stabilized. So just think about what you're bringing in and whether or not you've got the environment, the space, the environment, and the staff to manage it. And then finally, on this slide, I want to talk about the physical state of the item. Can you fund conservation? Does it need conservation? Is it of value to you that you potentially put other items in your collection at risk? Is there evidence of pests? Is it a moldy item? Is it worth it to bring in to your collection? And that, again, that's the part of this donation appraisal. This here is an image of kind of a half of an image of red rot. Red rot and actually also some pest damage. If you look a little closely, you'll see that there. If some of you aren't familiar, red rot is so leather. It's organic, just like us. It's gone through its skin, cow skin. It's gone through a tanning process, which is significantly changed, like the item down to the cellular level. It's made it mostly waterproof. It's made it, able to take in salts and liquids. That's why horse saddles are made of leather and they're tanned. And so what happens though is over time and in the wrong environment, especially one that is very hot, very dry. Even if you have something that's in a window, and for most of us, we'd probably be thinking about books, leather-bound book collections, or even just a single item. Those are usually the typical culprit that we see coming through our archives, not so many horse saddles. But what happens is the cells break down, and the leather becomes powdery, and then now you've got a mess on your hands, a literal mess on your hands. Anybody who's ever held a red rot item, whether it's a book or some kind of piece of clothing, boots, what have you, and you use maybe those cotton gloves, you will find that you can wash those cotton gloves, but they are never going to be the same again. And the thing with red rot dust is that it gets everywhere. So what you definitely don't want to do is, when you're processing things and you're looking at everything, you definitely don't want to have your red rot item right next to your photographs, and especially not your documents, because you definitely don't want that dust transfer. So you have to think about whether or not it's actually worth it to have in your collection. What's so special about this book? Is it something that is so special that you want to have it conserved? Do you have the funds for conservation? Would the donor be willing to contribute funds for conservation? Sometimes you can get them to do that. Sometimes you can create a special fundraiser just for the conservation of items. And we've even done things where it's like adopt an object. And some folks have contributed specifically to something that they feel, maybe it wasn't like a personal attachment to them, but something that they have a particular nostalgia about. So maybe like a beautiful iron toy collection, and there's somebody that's either in your community, or someone that's a member of your organization who feels a particular affinity towards that. So you can compel them to maybe make a monetary donation so that you can have that conserved. But these are all these are all things here that I want you all to think about when you're receiving in a donation. In fact, I might even change this slide to read donations and appraisal, because really, and I suppose acquisitions too, something that you see that may be coming up for auction might be of interest to you. But again, you have to ask yourself all of these questions. What's the physical state? Does our environment actually hold up to be the most responsible place for this object? Does it actually fit our mission, or does just somebody on the board think it's cool? So these are the things that you're dealing with. These are the questions that are just kind of running through your mind when you're going through the appraisal process. Okay, just a quick word about donations. Since really this is all appraisal and the beginnings of receiving in items like donations, we have to think about protecting our collection. It's like I said, it's living, it's breathing, it needs pruning, and it needs a lot of care on the front end. This is sort of what the slide where it's the best defense is a good offense, right? It's a lot harder to deaccession items than it is to accept items on the front end by thinking about how the value of that item fits in with your mission. So let's just talk really quickly about working with donors. A common issue is the fear of upsetting or angering a donor and thereby removing any chance for future donations. But setting an example of accepting anything and everything is problematic. I have a quick example. A woman came to the Historical Society with a bag, and in the bag was her grandmother's christening gown. Now, she was in her 60s. She had children and grandchildren of her own. And she had said that her grandchildren and children were not interested in the item. I hear that a lot. So she thought the Historical Society should have it. And she kind of ambushed me a little bit with this object. But what I was able to do is I explained to her that in the collection, we currently already had about 12 christening gowns. And the date range was somewhere between, probably, I would say, if my memory serves correctly, somewhere around 1850s all the way to about the 1930s. We had different styles, we had different fabrics, we had different levels of how, fragility. So I kind of had to tell her, like, I've got enough of these, and maybe though your children and grandchildren will want it. She was convinced they wouldn't. I said, well, I'll tell you what. But I had this nice conversation with her. I didn't just sit there and say no. I also didn't say yes. And I knew that we weren't going to take it. I wasn't going to prolong the inevitable with a temporary custody receipt. I just felt like that was going to drag on and give her hope where there really wasn't any hope for us to take it. But what I did want to do is give her some options. And I told her about how she could have it conserved, how she could bring it back to its former glory, how, it was stained. It was really wrinkled. It had been kind of basically stored in a ball. So I gave her some references to some conservators that were in the area. Thankfully, where I live, where we are here, and where I'm speaking to you from, we have New York City just 30 minutes, an hour away. So there's conservators that are easily found, but you can go and find conservators that are reputable. And I had her go and speak with somebody. She had it conserved. And then once it came back to her in the box with everything just so beautiful, she was so excited about it. And then she said, she called me back a few months later, actually several months later. I almost had forgotten all about it. And she said, my daughter wants it now. So it's going to stay with her. And she said she didn't want it. And I said, that's the thing. It's like when it comes to family, sometimes they don't want it right away. But then they realize as time goes on that these items are very important to their family history. So it was important for me to be firm with her, but it was also important for me to let her know that she had been heard, that I sympathized with her problem, because I wanted her to know that we are here for our community. We're here to take care of the history of the community, but some things we just can't take. And even though it's something small, even though it was something very small, like a christening gown, once you open that Pandora's box, the last thing I wanted her to do is go to somebody or talk to her neighbor and just say, hey, the Historical Society will take it, because now you got a big problem on your hands. So being honest with donors and doing what you can to be proactive to let donors know what you will and will not accept is in everybody's best interest. Let them know how you value their support, but you must stand by your mission and your collections policy. So this will save you a lot of heartbreak and headache. If you are really firm with your collections policy and your mission statement. So for example, I'm collecting for the town of Patchogue. I'm not collecting for Long Island. I'm not collecting for New York State. I'm not collecting for the South Shore of Long Island. And where does that even begin or end? Where's the north part? Where's the south part? Where are the boundaries? If you don't really have a firm focus on what it is you will collect and from what area, then you can get yourself in a whole lot of trouble, because you might have to find yourself saying no a lot more often than yes. Temporary custody receipts are your best friend, because again, it gives you a chance to sort through items and decide whether or not it's maybe you want this, but not that. And then the other point I wanted to make is that being able to let donors know ahead of time what you're looking for. So on your website, or just even in a mailing, if you do a newsletter or something like that, put in your newsletter, hey, these are the kinds of things we're looking for from our community or for our constituents. This is what we're looking for from our members. We're looking for identified photographs. We're really not interested in unidentified photographs, but we would love any of your identified photographs. We would love to have textiles that are in good condition. We would love to have items that, it always boggles the mind when I talk to people and they say, oh, well, don't you want this eraser? And I say, not really. But then they'll have a postcard and I'm like, oh, and they're like, oh, you want this postcard? They don't, sometimes donors don't even know they don't know what you don't have and what you do have. So, trying to be as clear with donors ahead of time will save you a lot of trouble and headache. So what do you need to know going forward? This picture on the left is what I used to typically get as part of a donation. And if I was lucky, it wasn't left on the steps. But what you need, if you take away anything from this, is a clear, realistic mission and collections policy so that when you are appraising, you know that you have this sort of narrowed or almost like a tunnel vision on what it is you're going to collect. Make sure that the team that you have working with you, even if you're a team of one or you and the maintenance guy, let everybody know and understand what the policy is and how to enforce it. Put together a simple temporary custody receipt so no new donations can be appraised before they are formally accessioned. Actually, did I mean to write that? Was that right? So actually, new donations can be appraised. Make donation decisions in a timely manner. And again, that just means going through those donations, even if you just have to have a quick glance and understanding what of those values that we saw in that earlier slide are contained in that donation. Make appraisal a recurring activity in your archives to help refine your collection. So appraisal should be something that is a part of your collections management policy because, and maybe even do it I wouldn't say even yearly, but at least 3 to 5 years. You want to do a regularly scheduled inventory. And probably at that same time, it might make sense to do sort of an appraisal checklist and just determine the different values. And then that can help you make deaccession decisions. And I like to end some of these with some quotes that I find to sort of kind of rally everybody into the same mindset. There's 5, this is from Gerald F. Gerald Ham. And this, and if you don't know who he is, he's pretty much one of the earliest authors of quite a bit of archival theory and just really trying to make the archives profession a little more professional. There are 5 analyses that make up the basic tools archivists need in their appraisal kits to identify and select records of enduring value. And these are an analysis of records' functional characteristics, of the information in the record to determine its significance and quality, of the record in the context of parallel or related documentary sources, so other things that you have in your collection, of the potential uses that are likely to be made of the record. So whether it's going to be used in an exhibit or as a teaching tool, or maybe it would just be great for researchers because you've seen the writing on the wall and researchers are kind of getting more and more interested in certain topics. So maybe that's something that will create more value in your collection. Of the cost of preserving the record, he uses the words record here. We'll just kind of substitute the word item. weighted against the benefit of retaining the information. So and that kind of goes and speaks again towards what we were talking about, whether or not the value or the informational value or evidentiary value or historical value of the item is worth what it's going to take to keep that item preserved. And then Elizabeth Yankel writes here, before any archival collections are processed, each should be ranked by the amount and depth of archival treatment based on current need, the collection's value to the organization, and the amount of time and work necessary to organize the materials. So again, just reiterating some of those earlier points. This is a list of resources that I've taken, into account when I was working on this, putting this together for you all. I just want to make a special mention that the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, CCAHA, has I would say recently, but it's actually a few years now, created a collections management policy toolkit. So I would, you can just Google that. You can just Google CCAHA and collections management policy toolkit. And I'd recommend that if you, just to get yourself started and familiar with that policy. Because it is going to be your shield. It is going to be the foundation by which you actually build your collection. And I think that is going to do it for me. I'm going to give some time here for questions. And Vincent, I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Nicole. Yes, for anybody who is still here for this Lunch and Learn session, if you have questions, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Right now, we don't have any. So we have about 8 minutes left. So for anybody with questions, please make sure to get them in there. And just to remind everybody that, yes, this is recorded, and it will be on the SAA-ARCS ARCS Resources YouTube channel, for which we will be sending out to everybody. We do not make the slides available. And first question, Nicole, what would you include in a temporary custody receipt?
Okay, so in a temporary custody receipt, and you can, you can use whatever browser you like and just type in temporary custody receipt. I would use quotations around that. And then something like archives or museum, and several images will pop up that should all look very similar. Essentially, it's just going to have a section where the donor would fill in their name, their email, all of their contact information. And then there's another section. Sometimes it's lined like paper, like school paper. Sometimes it's just a block and you have to write in the open space, but it's a space for you to describe. And sometimes if it's easy, if it's just say like a coffee mug, that's pretty simple. If it's a box of things, you may have to take a little bit of time and sort of just sketch it out, like several envelopes full of photographs, something like that. So you'll just have a section for describing, and then it's just a section where the person agrees to leave it at your location. You sign it, they sign it. They're also agreeing to leave it at the location for somewhere around, and you make this determination based on your staff and your needs, somewhere between usually 30 and 90 days. I usually like to only keep things around for like up to 30 to 60 days, something like that. So just say, we're going to keep this for up to 60 days, determine whether or not we're going to keep it. And then if we do decide not to keep it, how would you like us to, what would you like us to do with it? And then there's a section where the donor would say, send it back to me or let me know, I'll come back and pick it up. Sometimes they're like, just dispose of it. I don't want it no matter what you want to do with it. And by disposal, we're not necessarily saying throw it in the fire pit. Usually it takes even more work to try and find a new home for these places, for these items. And then you both sign it, make a copy of the signature, or just make a copy, send the donor with that paperwork off, and then follow through and try and get a decision made about that collection or pieces of that collection within the time frame that you told that donor that you would do it. So like I said, thankfully, so many organizations are generous enough with their forms, and you can find several samples out there, print off 5 or 6. You'll see that they're all kind of very similar in language, and you can create your own in a document.
Next question might potentially be the last, depending on your answer. There was an example recently on Archive Think Tank about retaining 2 lumps of coal and vials of coal dust in a collection related to labor organizations for coal miners. Which value would the coal lumps and coal dust have from the archival value cloud? I thought they wouldn't be unique in any way, but could have exhibition/educational value.
Oh yeah, it would definitely be something great for an exhibition and for education. So yeah, I think, gosh, now even I have to go back and think about my my list of values, but right. So I would have to go with probably evidentiary value. I'm thinking about, like, just how like evidential, which is like how something functioned, how a group, or maybe like a job, or like you said, like how coal mining actually, what was the end result, right? So I think that would be evidentiary. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I don't know if I'd keep tons and tons of it around, but it definitely have like a healthy amount of the best kept coal and coal dust, and just make sure that's nice and secure so that it doesn't get amongst other parts of your collection, and doesn't in any way. I would just double check and make sure that there's nothing that could be harmful. I imagine coal dust could be very harmful to someone with, say, an asthma problem. So just, kind of do a little research. Do we have any time? Is there any other questions? I couldn't tell.
One more person who suggested that it could potentially be artifactual.
Yeah, sure. Like I said, you can have many different layers of value to an item. It can have, it can be historical, it could be evidentiary, it could be legal, it could be many of those things. It doesn't have to just check one box. But ideally, when you're accessioning an item, you're appraising an item, excuse me, it'll have more than just one value for your organization. Ideally, it'll have several different values, but yeah, so I'm just going to stop there.
I think that will finish it up for us.
Oh, that's perfect. Perfect timing. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And
thank you, Vincent.
Thank you, everybody. And everybody have a great afternoon.
Take care.